Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast, and if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
We'll start the podcast, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on to the podcast to be able to, discuss a little bit more about your article that you wrote, kind of going back into your journey of your heritage. So, I'll get you just to start off to introduce yourself to everyone.
So my name is María del Pilar Kaladeen, and I'm an associate fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which is part of the University of London. And that's where I'm based.
Mm-hmm.
And I work specifically on the history of indenture in the Caribbean. And I work on an idea additionally called the Other Windrush, which is my exploration of how the stories of Indian Caribbean people who came to UK as part of the Windrush are not really being amplified or shared in the way that they could be.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, and the article that you wrote, it was a daughter's journey from Indenture to Windrush. So I just wanted to ask, what was your why to write this article?
Well, you know what? So the editor of that book, Grace Anisha Ali, who's a curator based in the United States, she contacted me to say that she was trying to assemble an anthology of writing by Guyanese women.
Oh.
And did I have anything to contribute? And at the time, I think that would have been around 2015, 2016. And at the time, my son was really little. And this idea of the journey of indenture to Windrush, I can remember specifically when it came to my mind. So I was on a bus with my son, and we were going past a cinema a former cinema in Kensington High Street, because all the old cinemas in London had started closing down, and they were either upgrading the buildings, turning them into cafes, and it struck me as we passed this cinema. I remember saying to my son on the bus, that building there, it used to be beautiful. It used to be a cinema, and I was aware that I was no longer one sort of floating generation in London, that in the process of having my son, I had rooted myself specifically to this city. And, the more, as he got older and I started to share more stories with him, I had this strong sense of being, I'm actually a child of Windrush, and feeling, even though I had studied the history of indenture before, but just understanding that my dad was also part of the Windrush migration, but because he was Indian Caribbean and his story wasn't seen as part of the Windrush generation, in spite of the presence of people like Naipaul and Selvon, both Indian, in the same migration. And I thought, well, hold on, actually, I need to speak about this. About this migrant, because it's now become, I felt more of a responsibility because now I have a child, and if I don't say something, what is he inheriting?
Definitely.
And I remember I remember just playing around when I got home with the Other Windrush, Indenture to Windrush, and looking at two photos which are really significant to me. One is my father's passport photo, which appears in the article that you read. And the other photo is a photo of my great-grandfather, who was in my maternal grandmother's side, the first of our ancestors to be born in Guyana. And those two photos were really important visual connections to me to understand, this story of Indenture to Windrush, how we had. And I remember kind of later on coming up with this line. I organised an event at the University of London called Indenture to Windrush, Invisible Passengers in Two Imperial Migrations. And it was the idea that the history, here in the UK, the history of indenture is widely unknown and unacknowledged. And then you have this second migration so Windrush is known, it is talked about, but what isn't known is that Indian people, and indeed Chinese Caribbean people, were part of this migration also. And because people don't know that there are Indian people in the Caribbean, they don't understand us to have been part of that migration. I thought, it's that, that idea of having this small person
yeah.
that you have responsibility for, and you don't want to experience perhaps the same rootlessness that you may have experienced. And it was that I do remember that moment, because I remember looking at him and looking at the cinema and thinking, there's a line that connects me and him and my memories, and if I don't draw it for him, I will risk that he won't see this really rich history that he's part of.
No, definitely, and definitely a rich history. And I guess not until you get the next generation, then the connections start to appear and connect. So, yeah. What was your experience, especially as a first generation in the United Kingdom? And was there a connection to your parents' heritage?
You know what, there wasn't, and it was quite it was really bleak. I don't remember anything positive or happy about that time. So I'm the child of a mixed marriage. My dad was Indian Guyanese and my mum was Spanish. And what they had done in crossing the colour bar at that time was very bold, and very brave. But I think for many reasons, their marriage was not a happy one. They struggled. There were five of us at home. And what I remember kind of most distinctly about that period is in the UK during the 70s and 80s, there was it was a very, very racist and I remember quite violently racist time. But there was a particular hatred of Asian communities and Asian people at that time. And the word, I won't repeat it, but there was a word specifically associated with that sort of racism, that people would hurl it at you in the street so casually.
Yeah.
Somebody would just pass you by and use it. And I remember, I do remember my brothers experiencing more of the violent side of that racism. People would call me that name, but not really necessarily try to start a fight with me. But I don't know if I can't remember now if I wrote about it in that article or a subsequent article, this moment that really, because it would have been one of my earliest memories, was of some neighborhood children throwing dog mess on the windows of the house, and it happened to be on the window of the room that I was sleeping in. And it was it's quite a memory to have, because it's the sense of somebody saying, this is what you are to us, this is what you are. To pick up excreta and chuck it at to throw it at the house. And I think that what was unique about our experience is we were not part of a community. And later on, when I met British Asian people, and I spoke to them about my experiences growing up, I think that a lot of the difference came from the fact that we were alone. So we had no, my dad had second cousins here, but they lived quite, they didn't live near us, and he didn't really keep in contact that much with them. So we were really alone. My mum had left her family in Spain. She came here after her parents had died. And it was that sense of having nowhere else to go. And my parents also having made that decision that I think perhaps a lot of people did in the 70s in the UK, not to give us this cultural heritage, not to talk about where they were from, because they believed that in doing so they were burdening us, or I think my mum particularly believed that she would be disadvantaging us educationally, in the sense that there was a real xenophobia at that time. So if I remember all the children that spoke Spanish and Portuguese being kind of in one line in a classroom, and their tables being separate 2 hours, and it was almost as, and they were not as though to say, well, you speak another language at home, therefore you must need some support. Your English must be wanting in somehow, which was not the case. But there was, so I think she thought, well, let me kind of, if I present these children as English, as British, then, you know, everything will be fine. And I mean, even more so, kind of, you know, I'm looking at the picture. I have 2 pictures of all of my brothers in front of me, and I'm looking at them now. They're like in their 70s clothes, and you know, the idea of saying at that time, well, these kids are English, they're British, you know, or even saying that to us, which they did. It's, you know, it would never have been accepted.
No, for sure.
Yeah. And so I mean, it was a bleak time inside the house and outside the house, and yeah, with little. I don't think I remember things as being, you know, I don't remember there being anything joyful. Although, you know, it's funny. Was speaking to one of my older brothers recently, and he said to me, "Do you know everyone was really happy when you were born?" And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, but well, because you were a girl. There were 4 boys, and then suddenly there was a girl, and everyone was really happy." He said, "Mummy and Daddy were really happy." And I was thinking, wow, you know, how, you know, because I mean, obviously that's not my memory.
Yes.
But yeah. So I think it's important to challenge my perception of events in that there was a story before I was born, and my older brothers do remember that, as well as kind of the sadness that came after, when the marriage struggled, and when, you know, and when my parents very obviously weren't getting along.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it definitely gives the whole story of how challenging it would have been at that time. And again, you know, not a real sense of, I guess, inclusion in society. Or did you feel that you didn't fit in anywhere?
No, I really felt that I didn't fit in anywhere. I'm trying to think if there were any pockets or spaces, you know, or moments. And I've written very recently for a magazine called The Funambulist, about being a teenager. And there was one moment I remember, which was, there's an actress called Sarita Chowdhury who was in a movie called Mississippi Masala when I was very young, and now she's in Sex and the City. But she did a photo shoot with a magazine called Sky when I was maybe 13 or 14. And she just looked absolutely gorgeous in this photo shoot. And I was totally taken aback, because I had never seen a woman of South Asian heritage being a model. And that was a big thing in my mind. Like, wow, you know, it's acceptable, because you know, we talk about kind of, you know, memories of being, memories of hearing abusive terms and abusive words, and particularly that very visual, you know, searing image of somebody throwing dog crap against your window, and people saying, you know, these awful things. To see something held up in that, or someone from your community held up in that way as something attractive, that was a big deal to me. That was a really big deal to me. Yeah.
And you know, I guess, you know, how did this kind of shape or frame your outlook at that time for, you know, for yourself?
Gosh, it's difficult to, you know, kind of, if I go back at that time, I was really just lost. I think we all were. I think, you know, what has subsequently been, I mean, I've lost 2 of my brothers. I've written about my brothers a lot, but the 2 that are still with me have often pulled me up, and after reading my work, and said, you know, and said how much they felt it, that they felt that story, that they, you know, and that, you know, to me, just to have that audience of two
Yes.
is a big deal for me, because it's the two people who lived through what I lived through. And I have to say, kind of, there were very few moments of there were very few moments where I wasn't feeling like everything was hopeless. I think, you know, the fact that you know, one wonderful thing my mum did was to teach us all to read very early, very, very early. She didn't rely on the school to do it. And the one thing that I was allowed to do on my own was go to the library. I think from the time I was quite young, I was allowed to go to the library on my own. My mum would take us to the library too when we were too small, and that was my escape portal. And as I got older, it became more of an escape portal, and more than an escape portal, it came to books came to represent somewhere where I could belong, or where I could be. And it's funny now that that's how I've made, you know, that's how I've made my world, my career kind of is about books, is about writing and libraries. Yeah.
That's really great, because I mean, I guess that was your peace, that was your comfort, to be able to kind of use books to escape.
Yes, yeah. And it's funny. If I think about it now, I think there are at least two of my brothers that were similar in that, you know. Yeah.
And then, so I guess, you know, when was the first time that you really investigated the heritage of your father, and what was that caused by? A certain event, or just a feeling to move forward with that?
Well, I got to, you know, I left school at 15, which is really young here. You're not allowed to leave school until you're 16. But I left school at 15. I was very rebellious as a teenager. And I had kind of a series of dead-end jobs. And I remember feeling, you know, I think just before I turned 18, just kind of feeling this is going to be me. You know, if I don't do something, this is going to be me. And you know, I could kind of see my life stretching out in front of me. I'm imagining a lot of the women I was working with at the time were around the same age I am now. They would have been in their 40s. And so it was very clear to me I was on a trajectory, and they had been doing the same thing. And I remember my dad actually also saying to me so many times, you know, this is not, you know, is this what you want? You know, you want to be like me, working on your feet 12, 14 hours a day. And I thought, you know, it's a question, isn't it? Is this what you want? Because if you want it, fine. But if you don't want it, now's the time to do something about it. And I guess that I thought, well, let me start to see. I wasn't confident at all. I had no confidence at all. But I thought, let me start to see if it's possible I can do something about it. And I very slowly, so I was with a correspondence college, and I very slowly just started studying, taking an exam here and there. And eventually I got to the stage where I was able to take an A-level in English literature. And that will still be, I think, even though I have a doctorate now, that will still be the biggest academic achievement of my life, because I'd done it on my own. It was my, you know, I'd sat at a desk. I didn't have a teacher. I had somebody I sent an assignment to once in a while. And yeah, it was a huge moment, because I thought, well, that's something that I've achieved something. And with this something, I could go to university. And yeah. So it was a really big deal for me. It was a really big, you know, something that kids here will, you know, they may get 3 or 4 A levels. That happens, you know. But I had one. And I think that one meant as much to me as somebody having 3 or 4, because of what it signified at that age. It meant that you could apply to be a mature student at university, which is what I did.
Yeah.
And at the University of Leeds, I had two amazing. So I did literature, but at the University of Leeds, in the Department of English, you do combined language and literature, and it wasn't my literature professors who inspired me at all. It was two of the language. Yeah, it was two of the academics who worked in language, and I remember one of them saying to me on that first week of study, he asked me where my name came from, and I said, "Oh, my dad is from Guyana." And he said, "Oh, do you know my favorite lecturer at university was from Guyana?" And I thought, "Oh, wow." Because to me, Guyana was a small country. I didn't know anyone else from there. Somebody told me once my dad told me that the cast of Desmonds were from Guyana, but I didn't really know anything more about it. And I thought, oh, wow, an academic from Guyana, that's, And then another lecturer had asked me something about my name, and she said, do you know how your ancestors came to Guyana from India? And I said, because all I knew at the time was Kaladeen meant gift of Kali. That's all I knew.
Yes, yeah.
That's what because somebody else had told me. And I said that, and I said, I don't really know. And I asked my dad, and he said to me, "Oh, well, you can blame the European sweet tooth for why your ancestors came." And I didn't really get it. I didn't know. And yeah, it was kind of I remember in those modules they would ask a lot about names and origins of names and your history and your culture and how that affected language. Whether you were bilingual or whether you phrase things a certain way. And and I remember, for example, one of my brothers, he used to roll his R's like a Spaniard, even though he didn't speak Spanish, because his main contact was with my mum. He was just copying her accent. And so for a long time he spoke Spanish accent. So they presented to me this idea that there are traces of your we're all carrying pieces of our and that to me was, at the time, it seems silly now, but that to me was revolutionary. This idea that I am the son of all these people that have come before me, and that whether I can see it or not, this this history is present in me. If it's in my name, if it's in the way I might pronounce certain words, or the things I hold genetically, like asthma, or it's all there. And it was from there that I think it was serendipity that my dad brought family to Leeds to visit me. His sisters came from Toronto to visit him. He brought them to Leeds to visit me. And it was then that it was around that time that I began to ask questions, and they would talk to me about what they remembered of their parents and their grandparents' stories.
Wow, it's always just the it always comes out of kind of nowhere, so to speak, in the sense of who's going to kind of initiate or spark that that little fire, so to speak, for you to kind of really look at things and decide. But you're right, it's definitely within us. It's just for us to kind of recognize that, other than being told, you laughed something similar to so and so back home type of thing.
Yes. Yes.
So with your relatives coming over from Canada, like, what were you able to uncover of the indenture to Windrush, and how did that make you feel?
I'm trying to remember now what I spoke about with my dad's sisters. So they told me I don't know how much they would have told me about the system of indenture. They talked about their parents a bit. And I think what they told me specifically may have been that my uncle had, in the 90s, which many people weren't doing then, that he had actually gone to the archives in Guyana and got copies of our our great-grandparents' indenture certificates,
Oh,
or
gosh.
emigration passes, I think would be more correct to say. And and you know what? I remember one of my aunts talking to me a lot about this man Kaladeen that we got our name from.
Oh.
And I found that so intriguing about how many children he'd had. About, you know what she told me, I remember this, it instilled a sense of pride in me.
Yes.
Because I thought she made it seem like, which, subsequently having studied the history, I realized that this was quite remarkable. Because he had managed to get he and his older sons have managed to get the last son off the plantation, so that my dad was the son of a tailor, which if you think within a, and that would have been because all of my grandfather's brothers would have worked hard to get him to school, so that he would have been, so that they were able to affect that change, within the space of a generation is really incredible.
Yeah, that's really significant.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so then, did this discovery, make you more connected to your heritage or disconnected?
No, it made me, it made me more connected, and I kind of resolved then to, that was quite a year. That year was quite a year, because it was also in that year I was doing a module in literature that was looking at some Caribbean writers. And I just remember being on a chair in the library and just stretching, just flicking out and stretching. And I caught the side of a book with my eye, and the spelling of the name was, at the end of the name was D-E-E-N. And I thought, oh, that's like my name. And it was a book by the Guyanese writer David Dabadine, who I didn't know. I had never heard of him. And it was called The Intended. It was a novel called The Intended. And I pulled it off the shelf. And it was just, I flicked it back, I looked at the author profile, and it said that it was a story of a young man coming to London from Guyana, and his difficulties growing up, and that the person that wrote it was a professor of literature at the University of Warwick. And I was like, holy, you're kidding me. Somebody from Guyana wrote a book about growing up in London, and how difficult that was, and the Indian Guyanese, because I didn't think, at the time, this identity to me, I mean, it would seem strange to anybody who's grown up in Queens or who's grown up in Toronto, perhaps even. Yeah. But there are not really, and there weren't really at that time, communities of or spaces in social media where you could go and say, I'm Indian Caribbean. Is there anyone else out there that is like me? But the library was that social network, right?
Yes.
Where you could go and perhaps find in different ways people who were like you. And so when I read that, I was like, oh my God, there's a book by this man. He's Indian guy. Are there any more? And there was a great collection in the library of writing by, because People Tree Press is in Leeds, of course, and they have published loads of books by Indian Caribbean writers. And so, that was life-changing for me, because those writers inevitably talk about indenture. Yes. So it's through kind of a combination of literature and history that I began to understand what the system was. And then I went to Canada. I spoke to my uncle. I got copies of the indenture certificates. I read more, and that's when I kind of this idea took hold that I would do my master's in research in Caribbean. So the two things were happening at the same time. I was professionally exploring it and personally exploring it.
Wow, that's quite the journey, and and quite the all the understanding, and just the whole scope of that. So with that journey of discovery, like, how did that change your relationship with your immediate and your extended family as well?
Well, with it brought, what I have always, can't say I have always been, because my dad passed away around this time last year. But I was always close to my dad. I think my dad was, although I didn't know what his cultural identity was, I understood that somebody said to me recently, I was talking about my relationship between my parents, and I love my mum very much, but she was unable to understand the things that we went through. She was white, and until she opened her mouth, she didn't experience discrimination. And when she did, it was a different type of discrimination.
Yes, yeah.
But my dad was there for me and believed in me and fought for me in a very aggressive and poignant way. He was really behind me. Somebody said to me recently, I understand, Maria, your dad was your parent. And that is exactly what it was, without bad talking my mum, who was, in her own way, an incredible woman. My dad was my parent. He parented me. I am his child, And I always, even without knowing the history, I understood this is my parent. This is where I come from. And the more I knew about it, the more I shared it with him. And then I kind of understood that it wasn't that he had denied me a history. It's that he had also been denied a history.
Yes.
Yeah. And that was, so to be able to share that with him was a wonderful thing. It was a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, I'm sure that must have, brought back a lot, and as well for, again, another set of discovery for himself as well, because with indenture, it's not necessarily very clear cut in terms of with people for where their history really is from as well within that context as well.
Yeah.
So you discussed your father, but would you be able to provide some insights as to why your father may not have discussed his family heritage further, other than he didn't know?
One thing it has been a real privilege to kind of to get to know and to understand is why people were reluctant to talk about the past to their children. So one thing, I was writing recently an article for an academic type of magazine. It's called The Conversation. And there's a part there where I quote David Daberdeen, who's subsequently become my colleague, and we've worked together on a couple of books. But there was a really moving section of a documentary he made on indenture, not just in Guyana, but also with Bridge Lowell in Fiji and Gandhi's granddaughter in South Africa. So they filmed the three of them separately talking about their roots. There's a very moving part in that documentary where David Daberdeen is standing in the archives in Guyana, and he's talking about the condition of the volumes there and saying that they have been exposed to the elements in a way that they shouldn't have been. They should have been protected. And you can see he's upset, but he doesn't want the staff to hear what he's saying.
Yes.
And he says in a whisper, I really believe that people don't want to remember the past. This is not a past of castles and Arthurian legends. This is a past of shame, Yes. And I don't view in any way those people that made that journey as shameful. I see them as warriors. I think they were incredible. If I look at the story, for example, of my dad's great-grandmother who came with a young child on her own. Who knows why she made that journey on her own. I just think, and that she survived, and she prospered even. My dad has memories of that little girl she came over with, she lived well into her 80s, and I think they were incredible people. But I think that indentured servitude, that idea of you being considered a disposable unit of labor, which indentured laborers were, it colored the way that they that they viewed themselves and their condition and what they wanted for their offspring, for their children. So there's an academic here called Clem Seacharan, who's also Guyanese, and he talks a lot about this idea of collective amnesia in the generation that would have been his grandparents and my grandparents also. And this idea that whatever they had left in India, many of the people that traveled would have been impoverished. Some people were fleeing famine. Mm-hmm. So this idea that we're here now, we don't need to talk about who we were there in India. We don't need to talk about who we may have left behind. Maybe people were ashamed of having left their family. Maybe people were escaping a spouse or familial obligations they were unable to fulfill. There are so many reasons why people indentured. A lot were duped as well. A lot were told things that weren't true about where they were going, how long it would take to get there, when they might be able to return. So there was a lot of dishonesty around the system. So with all those things in mind, you can understand why people didn't want to talk. But having said that, people must have, because we're here and we're able to tell stories about it. So those two things kind of coexist, this silence with a few breaks in the silence here and there, a few brave people who said, like one of my aunts said to me a few years ago, she sat me down and said, nobody is going to tell you this except for me, but if your grandmother was alive, she would have wanted you to know. And she proceeded to tell me this family story. And I thought, wow, that's, it's those little ruptures that kind of, are so important for people like me, because, we're trying to bring as many stories as we can together to pass on for, the people that come after us, which I guess that's what this is all for, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Just so we can, know what that story is like, however it may be shaded, and how people may be able to view it, but it is there, and it is to say that you have history, right? So we all have that, and just like how you're tapping into your heritage, how has that changed your viewpoint moving forward, and what has it for you to ensure that this is communicated again to the next generation?
So I've got to say that all of my work and my writing is is kind of about this history and about challenging this silence, because I think that's the most important thing that we can do. I do not judge anyone who wants to keep silent about their past. I think there are so many reasons why people choose to do so, but I think that those of us must speak. I think that that's really important. And I feel, I've got to say, I have never in my life felt stronger than that moment I came back from Guyana with my dad. That was just incredible, for someone not born in that country, to be able to visit it for the first time, with the person who connects you to it. Mm-hmm. That was priceless. That was really priceless.
Yeah, it's definitely, I'm sure a lot of emotions would have come through for you at that time, and, everything going through your, what you're thinking about, and probably, questioning some of your, your thoughts of, why did we have to have this type of life? But at least it gives you a different kind of viewpoint. And I totally agree with what you're saying. Not everybody is on this same journey and can be able to, as you said, discuss. And so we have to respect that. But for the ones that are going to discuss and they are going to talk about it, there's a reason for that energy and that drive for them to continue, to further discuss and push that out there, so people can be able to connect to it.
I agree totally.
And I know that you mentioned a little bit about your mother, but would you be investigating that side, the maternal side of your family as well, or?
It's so funny you asked that at this moment where we're talking about silence, because I did it. I was talking about kind of my dad being my parent, and essentially my mum being this, and I'm sure she felt this way as well. I'm sure she felt this way. Just this Spanish woman who lived in the house with us. And it took me a long time to understand her as my mother. And I think she deliberately kind of separated herself from us. And I don't know. I'm sure there were a lot of, when you're older, you understand your parents in a totally different way.
Yeah.
And I am sure that for a woman who had come from a different country to live in the UK, parents had passed away.
Mm-hmm.
She had no other family. I am sure that she must have felt incredibly alone, and not with any intention, just kind of cut herself off from us. It's funny, at the point that I submitted my master's, I remember my mum saying to me, do you want to come to Spain with me? I'd like to take you to Spain.
Oh, wow.
And I was just thinking, where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And what is it connected to? And I wonder if, I'm thinking at the age she was, I wonder if she thought, I'm going to die, and all this child is going to remember is that her dad was Guyanese. Yeah. And I was kind of like, I'll come, I'll come for, of course, let's just go, we had never been particularly close. Yeah. But that journey became a pattern where we would go. So I think it was in my mid-20s when that started, around then. Mm-hmm. Where we would go to Spain kind of once a year or every couple of years. And I remember asking her once something about Franco, and about the time that she'd grown up in Spain, and about growing up under a dictatorship, kind of half interested, half not. And it was just the way that she responded to me. It was so chilling, because she was talking about the existence in the history of Spain of people snitching on each other, and just go, like, the butcher doesn't like the baker, the butcher goes to the authorities and said, I heard the baker say something bad about the regime. And just, but it was just the way she said it. I was kind of like, oh my God. And I remember her talking also, she would open up a little bit more, and she would talk to me about her dad being very scared of her discussing politics outside the house. Wow. And I kind of thought, when the more I learned about that period of time, about dictatorship, I just thought, oh my God, this woman was, this woman was not in any sense a villain. She was a victim of this, not of the dictatorship directly, but of the environment that it created. Exactly. Where a woman had to get permission from a male relative to get a bank account, to have a passport, to leave the country, was not considered an adult until she was 23, was unable to vote, all of those things. Mm-hmm. That environment that she grew up in, that kind of environment of terror, because it is terror. Yeah. For you to wake up one morning and learn that somebody in the village is gone. Yes. Exactly. They're not coming back, and in all likelihood, they may have been murdered by the authorities because it said that they said something bad about the regime. That is terror. That is real terror, because you are thinking in advance about everything you say, the interaction you have, and kind of. Yeah, so I have started to. I a few years ago I began to learn Spanish, which is, at this age, is so hard, but I love it. And I feel so blessed that the more I learn about this past, the more I understand my mum, and why, even though there was a Spanish community here in the UK, she was not a part of it at all. So there was a very distinct, in contrast to my dad, there was a very distinct Spanish community here in London, but she was never part of it. She wouldn't acknowledge it. And I do understand that was partly perhaps her politics, and the fact that she came from, I would say she came from a relatively middle class background, and but I think also the fact that she had married somebody who was not white, it would not have just been frowned upon. I mean, there are very serious issues with racism in Spain even now that persist. So for her at that time to have married out, as it were, it would have been considered, scandalous in the community. She very deliberately did not maintain those connections, did not teach us Spanish, and did not say to us when we were children, okay, we're off to Spain to connect with the culture, because she never believed Spain would accept us. And I can totally see, now when I read stories of mixed heritage families in Spain, I totally get her making that decision.
No, absolutely. And just for the fact that you mentioned about, those stories that are being told, so it gives a little bit more context of what those times would have been. And as well, it opens them up to start talking, which, is, when I look back on it, when I talk with some of my family members, I mean, it gives a connection. It gives them to be open and to give a vulnerability, to be able to discuss things that they probably hadn't talked about for decades.
Oh yeah. No, you're so right. I remember my dad saying to me, I feel so sad now, because when I was a teenager, all I wanted to do was go and see the latest movie. He said I wanted to go and see Burt Lancaster or Kirk Douglas. I didn't. He said, now you're asking me these questions. I think, why the hell didn't I ask my grandfather or my grandmother? Why didn't I ask them? Who were you?
Yeah.
This woman born in India, living in Georgetown, Guyana, well into her 80s. Why didn't I ask her, what was your life like in India? Do you remember the journey? Do you remember? And I totally understand that, because I think sometimes we imagine we have all the time in the world.
Yes.
With these people, we don't. We really don't.
No, for sure. I mean, I'll just say for myself, I know my mom would always talk about her yaya, and her yaya was her grandmother. And it's just to hear that, oh, you had a grandmother. You don't really think of your parents as having, their own. But when they start talking that way, to say, about their grandparents when they grow up and what they learned, and it just makes them a little bit more, oh, you're not just that authoritative person. You did grow up as well, right? So
exactly. It allows you to see the person in all their beauty. This just the idea of my dad and my mom being scolded by her father, please do not talk about politics outside this house. Makes me think, this was, she was a young woman who was engaged in politics in Spain at that time in the 50s, peak of the dictatorship. How scared must her dad have been,
Unbelievable. And so, what would you say to anyone that wanted to take a deeper dive into their family history as a first or second generation immigrant?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I am aware. Lakshmi Prasad, the Trinidadian writer, passed away, I think the day before yesterday, and she would have been in her 80s, and she was one of the few. She was one of the few writers or one of the few writers who's kind of acknowledged and reflected and written about the women's experiences, Indo-Caribbean women's experiences as part of Windrush. And she's passed away. I think she was born the year after my dad. She was born in 1939. My father passed away last year. I lost my mum in 2019. I've had a series of bereavements. I lost my favorite. I know my other brothers won't mind me saying this. I lost my favorite brother in 2021. And I think the thing I would say is have a respectful urgency about what you do, because life is so short. Life is so short. I remember on my 40th birthday, my dad called me up and he said, he said, just yesterday you were a little girl. And I totally get that, because I feel that way now about my son. It just seemed like a minute ago I was carrying him around everywhere. And now I struggle to keep up with him. And yeah, I think your time is so short. You don't have as much time as you think you do. And other things will come into your life that will take up your time too. Yes. So yeah, I would say if you are considering looking at your past, have a respectful urgency about it. And you don't be discouraged if one person won't talk to you or two people won't talk to you. Don't, because if you keep it up, somebody will share, and you'll find somebody who wants to talk to you. Maybe not somebody directly involved, but you'll find your stories where you find your stories. So be persistent. Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. That's very true. You definitely will. It may not be in the immediate branch, but definitely outside of that. That you'll be able to find someone, as you said, to tell their stories, because I think for them it's another way of them reliving that experience too, right? Mm-hmm. So for them to be able to kind of at least say it to somebody else that is willing to listen.
Yes.
Willing to listen, and that makes a difference. That makes a difference. So as we end, finally, what would you have, like, as any final thoughts that you'd wanted to leave the listeners?
I think I'm just thinking about, I'm just kind of thinking about how there is a connection, just reflecting on, on this news that Lakshmi Prasad passed away. I'm just thinking about the value of literature to history. And I'm thinking about, so my dad's, if I look above my desk now, there's a picture of my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather was from a minority community of South Indians. So they were a minority within a minority, if you like, during that period. And one of the first ways I came into contact with this story was through a novel called Henry's Cure by a Guyanese politician who wrote a novel, and it's faction, if you like. It's a blend of fact and fiction. It's him telling the story of his great-grandparents, and it's the story of a South Indian community who live in Babis in Guyana, and it's really beautiful. It's a fantastic novel. But I remember not long after Naipaul had died, there was a display in a bookshop of Naipaul's works, and because Nagamutu's name was also spelt with an N in the shelf, I just stumbled across it, and as soon as I saw the Peepal Tree press spine, I realized, this is a Peepal Tree book. It must be from Guyana or Trinidad, and that's how I came across that book. But when I read it, I called my dad and I said, I've just read this brilliant book by this Guyanese writer, and it's about this group who are a minority group in Indenture. This was like 2000, I think. Wow. And they were, there are some fantastic stories about them. And he said, I know that because my granddad was part of that community, and I was just totally blown away. Yeah, so not the grandfather, obviously, that we take our name from. But I've written about, that's what I did my master's on. That story, my master's came from that book. The inspiration for it was Henry's Cure. So I think just be aware of how much in our stories, stories from the Caribbean, just be aware of how much history is in literature. And there are so many treasures for you to discover.
Oh, absolutely. There is.
Yeah.
So, but thank you so much, though, Maria, for coming on and to speak about this, because it just gives another perspective as to how to kind of look at things when you are going down that journey, down that path, and what to kind of take with you as your armor in your tool belt to kind of ask those, whether asking those questions, but at least to be able to talk and discuss and to be open-minded about it. So Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be asked to do this, and it was so nice to chat with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.